I read of a man who stood to speak at the funeral of a friend. He referred to the dates on the tombstone from the beginning to the end. He noted that first came the date of birth and spoke the following date with tears. But he said what mattered most of all was the dash between those years. For the dash represents all the time that they spent alive on earth, and now only those who loved them know what that little line is worth. For it matters not how much we own, the cars, the house, the cash. What matters is how we live and love, and how we spend our dash. I am honored to be able to present a few stories of the life of Grandpa Hansen. My earliest recollections of my grandparents go back to when I was 6 or 7 years old, visiting them on the farm in Farron, Emery County, Utah. Grandpa was a lean, hard-working, no-nonsense man. At that young age, I never understood how life's hard knocks toughen up a man and a woman. My dad and mom had both moved from central Utah. She was from Emery Town, and Dad was from Farron, to California to work. There they found each other and married. Dad was drafted in the war and was literally boarding a troop ship when he was notified that he was a dad. My father fought in the Pacific and was twice wounded. More on that later. Following the war, they relocated to Sacramento. Family roots brought our little family back to Utah, where we found a small home in Pleasant Grove. Summers meant trips to Emery County and time on the farm with grandparents. Looking back, I know that my grandparents were dirt poor, bedrock Mormon pioneer stock, grounded in the gospel of Jesus Christ, scratching out a living as best they could. To me, however, they were larger than life. There were horses to ride, chores to do, cows to milk, wood to chop, and bring in to heat the stove. Deer hunts and family ties. I loved it. Many of my core values and my feelings about the Constitution and the love of family come from my grandparents and mother and father. Robert Leslie Hansen was born of Danish stock. His great-grandfather, Hans Jacob Holst, accepted the gospel in Frederikshavn, Denmark in 1837. From Grandpa's story, I was born in Fountain Green, Sanpete County, Utah, the 26th day of March, 1894, a son of Niels Christian Hansen and Mary Lenora Leslie. I was the oldest of 7 children, 1 sister named Lenora, and 5 brothers, Leo, Clifton, John, Orson, and Glenn. My dad was named for my grandpa's brother, Leo. Many of the family were named after brothers and uncles and so forth. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's interesting that this would be his 3rd statement. He went on to say, I graduated from the 9th grade in Fountain Green School. Most kids in that area were only able to go to school up to the 5th grade. I enjoyed athletics and was a foot racer in which I ran the 100-yard dash in 10 seconds. I could stand flat-footed and jump 10 feet on the level. I have heard some who could jump further, but I have never seen anyone do so. I've never seen my record broken. When I was only 14 years of age, I drove a team of horses and hauled coal from the head of Huntington Canyon. At the time, this road out of Fairview, Utah, was a toll road. We had to pay 25 cents for each horse that traveled on it. I usually took 3 horses to pull my load of coal to the top of the mountain. The road was very narrow, just wide enough for a wagon. If I had a spot now and then for passing and saw a wide spot, you could always look to see if another wagon was coming, and you waited for them to pass. This is an experience very dear to me. The most beautiful teams of horses from all Sanpete County were on this road. My first job when I left the farm was working for the electric power company. I helped build the power plant at Fountain Green. Then I worked for the company as a serviceman. I also worked as a lineman all through the county. Now that I was old enough and didn't know any better, I quit this job and went shearing sheep with Uncle Joe Leslie and others. Once I shore 105 sheep in 3 hours in a contest. Closest man to me shore 95. That was in July in Montana. Those sheep cut like hot butter then. Next, in my working career, I worked at the Magna Utah Smelters. I worked there for 3 years, and then the doctors told me I was getting too much dust in my lungs and recommended I quit that job. In the meantime, the United States watched World War I unfold in Europe and tried to maintain neutrality. However, much support was sent to England and France during the first few years. I find it amazing that an incident far-off country in Europe in 1914 could ripple to cause such a young man from a little town of Farron, Utah, to end up on the battlefields of France, which nearly cost him his life. In February 1915, Germany posted a notice in a New York newspaper declaring that any ship crossing the Atlantic would be assumed to be carrying war materials to the Allies and would be targeted. In May 1915, the passenger ship Lusitania was torpedoed and sunk. It was inevitable that sooner or later the U.S. would be drawn into the conflict. In January of 1917, the U.S. entered the war. On April 6, 1917, the House passed a bill creating the Selective Service System. Every eligible young man ages 21 to 31 had to register and awaited his number to come up. Grandpa wrote only 2 paragraphs about his experience in World War I. However, in Family Search, there is a copy of the book, The History of the 362nd Infantry, which contained much more information. Like most veterans, not much was said about what happened to them in war. I'm sure that Grandpa saw and did things in war that had to be pushed deep into his memories. To retell it was to relive it. I found this to be true of my own father's experiences. From the book, The History of the 362nd, I learned many details that Grandpa left out. And I don't want in any way to glorify war. It is evil and it's fostered by Satan and it's intended to destroy the agency of man. There is nothing good about war. However, the young men and women who respond to their country's cries for help are heroes in my mind. Like thousands and thousands of other young men, Grandpa's number came up, and he was sent to Camp Merritt in New Jersey for 2 weeks of training. Quoting Grandpa, "I was then drafted into the United States Army from Salt Lake County, Utah. I went with the 91st Division to Tacoma, Washington, to Camp Merritt, New Jersey. I was there for 2 weeks and sent on to England. We were 18 days and nights crossing the Atlantic Ocean from New York to Liverpool on the ship Empress of Russia. This was a big freight boat. It hauled 6,000 of us and was very crowded. Our bunks were 3 deep and just wide enough apart to go between walking sidewards. We landed in Liverpool, walked across England, where we loaded on a boat. During the night, we crossed the English Channel. This was a rough ride. We were slopped back and forth like sardines in a can. The convoy was watched over by observation balloons who were constantly looking for the dreaded German submarines. Upon arrival in Liverpool, the 91st marched many times to rest camps until they were eventually taken by train to the ports of Southampton, England, where they boarded ships to cross the English Channel. By the beginning of 1918, the U.S. had 2 million troops in France. The American troops were able to receive additional training in France as General Pershing was reluctant to put U.S. troops under the command of French generals. By the day the 91st moved closer to the front, they had marched through Le Havre, Montaigne, Leroy, Hondo-Marin, and finally arriving in Saint-Michel, September 11th. Then on to Membercourt and Belcourt. One march, the men went 26 kilometers with 60-pound packs. From the book, companies moved into the front line for the most part during the midnight hours. Some of them met yelling, swearing French soldiers in their mad rush for the rear to escape the storm that was about to burst. No pen can describe the grandeur of this mighty bombardment. It filled the soul with awe. With a couple of distinguishable booms, the American artillery began, rising in half a minute to a continuous sound. The ground shook, the trees were swaying. Those shells whistled, bellowed, and screeched, reaching their target. Exploded with horrendous bursts as they hit the German trenches and dugouts. And they kept it up, a din and a roar that sealed the ears and dammed up the brain. Talk was possible only by putting mouth against an ear and shouting. Sleep was impossible. Nothing to do but sit and listen to those shells and wish that every one of those shells meant less Germans on the advance. Late in the afternoon of September 25th, detailed orders arrived calling for the attack the next morning. The last objective was set some 28 kilometers away. That meant the penetration of the entire German system of trenches and defensive works that had resisted 4 years of efforts from the French. It meant giving Germans the tremendous advantage that came from being on the defensive in rugged, hilly, forested Argonne territory. The men were told what was to take place. They were to go in the frontline trenches and go over the top at 5:30 in the morning. Only those who have gone through such an ordeal know the thoughts and feelings experienced by the soldier when they realized that the great hour toward which they had been looking for months had arrived. At such a time, it lost all its charm and glory. War loomed up in all its hellishness and frightfulness. Progress was marked by steady, though heavy, fighting. Little groups of American soldiers worked to the flanks of machine gun nests and bayoneted Germans, or sent them onward with grenades, their handiwork remaining in the little heaps of bleeding bodies. Snipers were plentiful, causing much trouble, for they were hard to locate and their damage was great. The German artillery began to play over the area, the shells bursting with frequency and considerable damage, some of them hitting German prisoners, as well as our own men. The men were like seasoned warriors, never hesitating in their advance, though their comrades on the right and left may be hit by machine gun bullets or mangled to pieces by shells. One minute there may be 2 or 3 specimens of perfect manhood. The next minute, nothing but raw carcasses and groaning, wounded stumps of arms and legs. It would be written of them in the French newspapers, "Words fail me to express the admiration I feel for the fighting men of the Allies. We are tired, but victory will come to us if we will keep fighting. There is no other course but to fight on. We must not give up. The safety of our homes and our country and the freedom of mankind depend on our action." The London News wrote, "Bravo, the young Americans. Nothing is more exhilarating than the way they fight." Grandpa wrote, "Let us give credit where credit is due. Every man, regardless of his station, helped win the war. It has been reliably stated that twice as many men were killed in this as had to be killed in previous wars. I learned and realized by now the value of liberty. Like Patrick Henry said, give me liberty or give me death." The old 91st Division went into action on the Argonne forests in France on the 26th day of September 1918. Grandpa was 24 years old. During the fighting in France, the Germans and later the Allies used horrible weapons of mass destruction in the form of gases including tear gas, chlorine, and phosgene. These gases floated like a thick fog across the battle lines. Some caused severe chemical burns on the skin, some caused convulsions and nausea. One gas, made up of a sulfide, was also known as mustard gas. This gas attacked the eyes and lungs of the soldiers and created burns on their exposed skin. After about 4 weeks of fighting, my granddad was exposed to this gas. From Grandpa's story. On October 14th, I was reported missing in action. Somehow, someone got me into a hospital where gas victims were treated. I had learned by now that I could live longer on water than food. After I was without food for 12 days, I can only remember begging for water. After 30 days in the hospital, I was sent to Vichy, France, to a world-renowned health resort with lots of boiling mineral waters. There, I convalesced for about 6 weeks. I was helped in the hospital, and I recovered somewhat and was released from the army when I could not speak louder than a whisper. Of course, they gave me my choice of staying in for more treatment or being shipped back to the good old United States of America. Our family doctor gave me 1 year to live. I took to the mountains all I could and have continued the exercises I learned in the army until this day. These exercises have saved my life, kept me going, I am sure. The war to end all wars ended on November 11th, 1918. While my grandpa was involved in the war, Grandma was learning some hard lessons of her own. Grandma's dad became very sick and had to have an immediate operation for him in order to live. To quote the story, Mother and the doctor took him to Salt Lake, which was the nearest hospital at the time. Before they left, Mother purchased a sack of flour and a couple 100 pounds of chopped grain, with which we hoped to fatten a pig. She put the flour in a large box and dumped the grain on top of it, telling me that if the inspectors came, I was not to tell them how much flour we had because she didn't know where the next might come from. I was now 17 years old, but had never had big responsibility. Now, suddenly, I had 2 kids, her siblings, a cow, a pig, 30 chickens, and very little in the way of food or feed for the animals. At first, I could shake cream in a bottle and get a little butter, and the kids had what milk they wanted. With an egg once a day and bottled fruit, we managed for a while. By the time they had gone for a week, it was evident that if Dad was going to live, he was going to be sick for a long time. Mother stayed in the Salt Lake City with a friend who ran a boarding house and allowed Mother to help clean in order to pay for room and board. By the 3rd week, I was rationing food, knowing that there was very little chance in this world for me to get any more. I gave the cow a flake of hay night and morning and let her run the orchard. I cut the chickens' feed a little, and in return, they rationed us accordingly. I walked to town about 1.5 miles each way, many times with less than a dozen eggs to trade for sugar and enough coal oil to lay us to bed. The 5th and 6th week dragged by. We had no butter and no more milk to drink, so we used what milk we got to soak bread. Our diet then became bread, milk, and fruit. My grandma was suffering with ulcers at this time. She had needed an operation, but when in all the excitement of her father's illness, she was forgotten to put on the back burner. When the bishop heard that Mother was home, he came to ask about Dad, and he realized the condition I was in. About 10 days later, the bishop arranged for me to get to LDS Hospital for an operation. While I was in hospital with Salt Lake, Robert was in hospital in France, but she said, I guess that things we didn't know didn't hurt us. When I got home, a very lovely girl was waiting for me. She was Frances Ivella Rhodes of Farron, Emery County, Utah. My grandmother was a direct descendant of Thomas Foster Rhodes. The Rhodes family has their own wonderful story of gold mines and sacrifice, and you may have heard about the Lost Rhodes mine. We had never talked of marriage, but she was meant for me. We were married on the 17th of December, 1919. Of note, my grandparents were married in Farron, Utah. They traveled to Manti in January to be sealed in the temple. This trip was by horse-drawn wagon, and it took 3 days. From Grandpa, our first son, Leo, was born on November 6, 1920, in a small home we rented out south of Farron. Our two next sons, Robert and Don, were born in a one-room cabin, which was ours. Robert died 4 years after his birth. The cabin was located out south of town, just a few blocks from the creek where we obtained our water. We lost our second son, Robert, as an infant, but raised a family of 4 boys and 1 girl. They were always a joy and a comfort to us. They were honorable and kind to everyone they met. I never owned a tractor, but in my opinion, I had the finest pulling horses in the whole area. Besides the farm work, their pulling ability was tested by the hauling of wood off Dry Mountain. When basic family needs were met, I tried to assist others. I often hauled wood from the mountains for the widows and did basic repairs on their homes. Grandpa wrote this poem, Ode to the Horse. O horse, you are a wondrous thing. No horns to honk, no bells to ring. No license buying every year, and plates to stick on front and rear. No sparks to miss, no gears to slip. You start yourself, you never slip. No gas bills mounting every day to steal the joy of life away. Your inner tubes are all okay, and you are sure they'll stay that way. Your spark plugs never miss or fuss. Your motor never makes a fuss. Your frame is good for many a mile. Your body never changes style. Your wants are few and easily met. You've something on the auto yet. Once we were privileged to have our church patriarch come into our home and give Vella and me a blessing. Leo, our first baby, was 1 year old at the time. As he walked across the floor, Patriarch Benedict Olson said, "In 20 years that boy will be in the army." In 1940, Leo was on the island of Leyte fighting the Japanese. Brother Olson told Vella that he did not mean to reveal that to us, but that Leo would be all right. This prophecy was fulfilled to the letter. My dad, Leo Hansen, fought in the Pacific at Leyte and Okinawa in some of the bloodiest battles of the war. He was wounded twice, but survived to see the end of the war and occupied Japan until being mustered out. Among other things, the patriarch told Grandpa was that his testimony would be as keen as a two-edged sword. In his history, Grandpa speaks of many times where this blessing was fulfilled. I relate one. A miracle came to me in the Manti Temple. One of my eyes, which had been operated on twice, was so irritated and inflamed I could hardly stand it. It had a tubercular tree growing on it. My spirit was very low, as 4 doctors in the Salt Lake Clinic had told me that they had to remove my eye the very next day. I asked Brother Hiram Zwayan if he would administer to me. I don't think he had ever refused to do anything anyone ever asked of him before or since, but he said, "No, Robert, you get a recommend from the bishop and I will take you to the temple." It is a long distance from Farron to Manti, so I thought that was quite something. I went, got my recommend, and Brother Zwayan took me to the temple, and there I was healed. Many other experiences have come to me to make my testimony as keen as a two-edged sword. We were living on a farm in an isolated area at this time, and our patriarch told Vella that she would feed many strangers and even some of the leaders of the church. We wondered how this would ever come to pass. The Lord works in wondrous ways, and as time went on, I got to work the church coal mines in Orangeville, Utah. Grandpa relates that by a series of seemingly unrelated events, he and Grandma were helpful in building the church-owned garage and apartments, and later helped build and was later called and managed the Bishop's Storehouse, Garage, and Apartments in Orangeville to support the church-owned mines and truckers. They indeed housed and fed many strangers, including many leaders of the church. Upon retirement, Grandpa and Grandma moved to a modest home in Pleasant Grove. Grandpa never really retired, but would always find jobs to do somewhere in the city. Our family was very close. Highlights of my growing up years were deer hunts with Grandpa and all my uncles and aunts in the mountains above Farron. They were better than any reunion. One memory I will never forget was a time when my older brother and I went deer hunting with Grandpa and my Uncle Ray. My brother Russ was about 12 at the time, and I was 9. My Uncle Ray was probably 16. We had ridden bareback on a horse up on the foothills of Farron, where Grandpa made us a small fire. We were to stay by the fire while he went out to find a deer. It wasn't long before a cold storm came upon us. It was a mix of rain and snow, and we were almost frozen. Grandpa returned to our little camp and realized he needed to get us out of the open. He put us on the horse, and we headed for the farm. Russ and I must have been crying from the cold, because long before Grandpa pulled us off the horse, made us walk back off the mountain. We held on to the horse's tail so that he wouldn't fall behind. My mom was fit to be tied when we came home. She was angry with Grandpa for years. On the other hand, Russ and I believe that experience helped us to grow. They say that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. We learned valuable lessons on that little hunt. Grandpa was there when I was on my mission, and when my dad, his oldest son, passed away on October 10th, 1968. When Grandpa passed away in 1976, I and my 3 brothers and 2 of his other grandsons were honored to hold the flag he so loved, Old Glory, over his coffin. Each of us were in our dress uniforms representing many of the branches of the military. His beloved wife, Ivella, died July 3rd, 1987. Both are buried in Pleasant Grove next to my dad and mom. The final entries in my grandfather's personal history are these. My desire has always been to do my best for my family, my God, and my country. I love the flag of the United States of America and prefer not to think of it as merely a flag, but to me, it's Old Glory. Each day, as I drove my horses to town to get the mail, I would stop by them in the street by the high school. I would stand on the hay rack and pledge allegiance to the flag that daily flew in front of the school. I considered this my great privilege. I love the land of the free. I've made mistakes in my life, which I regret, but I always tried to do what I thought was right, and I'm very proud of my children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. They are all upright citizens and seem to be striving to live righteous lives. God has been very good to us. It's my hope and prayer that each of my family members will stay close to God and learn to resist the evil of the world. Somehow we must all learn to be in the world, but not of it. I'm grateful to be a member of the church in which there is priesthood authority, which can assure me of family togetherness in all the eternities. So, think about this long and hard. Are there things you'd like to change? For you never know how much time is left that can still be rearranged. If we could just slow down enough to consider what's true and real and always try to understand the way that other people feel, and be less quick to anger and show appreciation more, and love the people in our lives like we've never loved before. If we treat each other with respect and more often wear a smile, remembering this special dash might only last a little while. So when your eulogy is being read, with your life's actions to rehash, would you be proud of the things they say about how you spent your dash?